Now, there are a number of things we want to do today. One is look at the background characteristics of Acts, trace the lives of the apostles. We'll take them right through to their death, their martyrdoms, and then apply the work of the Holy Spirit in the lives of the apostles to our own lives. And, of course, the fourth one, which isn't written, is to be able to say, from memory, the names of the 12 apostles. Now, I have to sing it. I can't say it, but I can sing it for you. Now, the author of the book of Acts is Luke. I see some of you have already written that down because we talked about that last time. And you may remember that the reason that we say Luke is the author is because of the we sections in the book of Acts. And in chapter 16, we've been hearing a secondhand account of what people did, and then all of a sudden it just jumps out at you in verse 10. Chapter 16, verse 10, it says, and when he had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go to Macedonia. This is when Paul had the vision. He was going up into the underbelly of Russia, and God calls him over to Europe instead. Critical point in history, wouldn't you agree? Christianity arrives in Europe instead of attacking the underbelly of Russia. Now, other people went that direction, but God knew where he had planted the seed and the harvest was ripe. So they went that way. And there's the first time we have the we section. Now, when you get to the passage here with the time in Philippi, the we sections drop out again for a while. And you get the impression that whoever was writing this first-hand account stays in Philippi. But by chapter 20, they start to show up again. And we have more, verse 5. But these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. And so the personal pronouns come in again. Well, as you begin to look through, you can find who the entourage, who's traveling with Paul. And the one whose name is conspicuously absent during these third-hand accounts is Luke. And so pretty much everyone has agreed that Luke is the author of Luke and Acts. He was also probably the pastor in Philippi for about 6 years. Interesting fellow. The dating of the book, well, I date the book toward the end of the period covered in Acts. It ends with Paul's imprisonment and impending release. If Paul was released from prison, there's some debate about whether he ever got out of prison. I think he was released. Then it would have been before Nero started his heavy persecutions in 64 AD. It would have been around 63 AD. So we write, on our system, we have Luke dated at 61 AD, written in Caesarea, and Acts written in 63 AD from Rome. So Luke probably follows Paul to Rome, and it's probably there that he writes his book. Now, there are a number of reasons that Luke writes the book of Acts. One of them is to commend Christianity to the Roman government. He goes to great length to include Paul's trials, transcripts, the comments made by the Roman officials. And so it's to commend Christianity to Rome. Also, it's to show the universal nature of Christianity. We'll look at that in more detail in just a minute. But you see the spread of Christianity. And that's the third one. It records the expansion of the church. So one, that Christianity is for all people. And secondly, Christianity is being spread to those people. Now look at the insert with me. John Hanna, in his New Testament survey notes, said that the most probable and immediate occasion for the book was that it was written to state Paul's defense before Caesar. In it, Luke would thus appear to be informing the judges at Paul's trial concerning the origins and progress of this little-known sect. Luke places special emphasis on Paul's utter sincerity and innocence of any charge worthy of trial. The book traces carefully how, when there was trouble, Judaizers, not Paul, started it. It indicates that the Roman governors actually had no charge with which they could indict Paul, and the record's earnest attempts on their part to find some charge to present. And then the Garamus file, which hopefully you read last night, I speculated that perhaps that's just what it was, a document for Paul's defense. And of course, the Garamus file is going to do everything backwards. It's going to say that the Bible is the answers, but what are the questions? What are the circumstances that prompt the writings? And so I have Theophilus write Luke a letter asking for more information. And the letter that Luke writes back, of course, will be the book of Acts. So you can think of this as a manuscript for a trial. Now, Acts is a sequel to Luke. We've talked about that a lot. It's a sequel to Luke. And I pointed out in your notes that histories tend to take two approaches. They either trace the major events day by day, year by year, kind of like a daily journal, or they open up a series of windows to give you a glimpse of what's going on, some of the great moments and personalities. And this is the approach that Luke uses. Now, it strikes me that Luke is a very detailed person, and I suspect his travel diary is rather thick. But he has a different purpose. God plants a different purpose in his writings. So he doesn't just tell us everything. And then the next day we got up and we traveled 5 miles, and Timothy got sick again, and and Silas wasn't as sympathetic as he might have been. And on the next day, he doesn't do that. He just stops at some of the key points and opens the door to show us what's going on in the lives of the apostles, in major turning points in their lives. Acts is developed around personalities. You remember in Luke, we talked about the fact that there's so many personalities and little vignettes that come out. The same thing is true in the book of Acts. In fact, you can outline the entire book of Acts around personalities. From chapters 1 to 5, the dominant personality is Peter. We have 3 of Peter's sermons, 2 of his arrests, and 1 jailbreak, which is going to be kind of typical of Peter. One interesting thing I'd like to say here about his first sermon. that your first sermon or mine could be like this. I remember my first sermon. So do about 500 people. I've been praying they'd forget. It's a long time now. I had several months to work on it. I had about 30 illustrations. I used almost the entire Bible because of the incredible depth of my understanding. It was a long day. But where I grew up, we'd have revivals. Every spring we had a revival. We put it on the calendar that this was going to be a revival, and then we would have one. And a revival basically meant that we would bring in an expert. Now, an expert is someone who knows what you know and lives out of town. And we would bring in an expert pastor, and he would preach every night of the week. And some people would come most nights. And usually by the end of the week, one, sometimes as many as 2 or even 3 people, mostly children, became Christians. I guess it was worthwhile. I mean, certainly it was worthwhile. But it was kind of like we'd put it in the calendar, pray as we wrote it in the calendar for about 5 minutes, then he'd preach for a week, hours on end, and 2 or 3 people would be saved. Now, there's a difference in the kind of revival that took place at my home church and what took place in Acts. Because you'll see the ratios change just a little bit. You see, they spend 7 weeks in prayer. They preach for about 5 minutes, and 3,000 people come into the kingdom. It's just a slightly different ratio, the same ingredients, but you see it's the mixture of the ingredients that makes a difference. Then you have Stephen, chapter 6 and 7.